What was done with the menstrual blood in ancient Egypt? Well, some of the most awkward and bizarre practices were normal in ancient Egypt. Opposite to what we know about pharaohs, as being brutal, they would be the chief guest of various events, and to show honor, they would perform masturbation before the public. But why? Not only that, but pregnant women in ancient Egypt would urinate on barley plants, while the royal family members would have sexual relationships with sisters and brothers. But things don't stop here. Some of the most questionable things were done in ancient Egypt and were considered normal. But what are they? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, we will tell you about the hidden side of ancient Egypt and the bizarre things that were considered normal. Let's get started. Number 15. Sacred prostitution. In ancient Egypt, sexuality and religion were often mixed. Sacred prostitution is believed to have been part of certain temple rituals dedicated to fertility gods like Min and Hathor. Min, depicted with an erect phallus, was the god of fertility and sexual potency. His cult emphasized the connection between sexuality and agriculture, with rituals that may have involved sexual acts to invoke divine fertility for the crops and the people. In temples dedicated to these fertility deities, priestesses or temple prostitutes engaged in sexual rites as offerings to the gods. These acts were believed to harness divine power to ensure the fertility of the land and the continuation of life. Unlike prostitution as we understand it today, these acts were sacred and performed in religious settings as a means of communication with the gods. Sexuality, in this context, wasn't seen as taboo or sinful, but as a powerful force of life that needed to be honored. The practice of sacred prostitution has parallels in other ancient cultures, such as the Sumerians and Babylonians, further suggesting that it was an accepted part of ancient fertility rites across the ancient Near East. Number 14. Pharaohs and ritual masturbation. This practice may sound shocking today, but in ancient Egypt, it was viewed as a profoundly important act tied to creation and fertility. That's because of the concept of divine masturbation, which is rooted in the Egyptian creation myth of Atum. Atum was said to have created the first gods, Shu, meaning air, and Tefnut, meaning moisture, through an act of self-pleasure. In doing so, he initiated the birth of the cosmos. For Egyptians, this wasn't just a myth, it was a spiritual truth, and pharaohs, seen as living gods, were expected to perform this symbolic act during fertility festivals to ensure the prosperity of the land. One of the most notable festivals where this occurred was the Festival of the Nile Inundation. The flooding of the Nile was the single most important natural event for the Egyptian people because it brought water and fertile soil, ensuring crops would thrive. Pharaohs would publicly masturbate into the river during this festival, symbolically reproducing Atum's creative power. This was believed to encourage the fertility of the land and guarantee that the Nile would flood as needed. The act itself was seen not as shameful or strange, but as an important and official ritual connecting the pharaoh to the gods and maintaining the balance of life. This public display also reinforced the pharaoh's divine authority, cementing his role as the intermediary between gods and men, responsible for the well-being of the nation. By participating in this ritual, the pharaoh was not only fulfilling religious duties, but also demonstrating his godlike power and control over Egypt's survival. Number 13. Incestuous marriages in the royal family. The idea of incest means marrying and having sexual relationships with close members of the family, including brother and sister. In ancient Egyptian royal families, incest was not a matter of choice. Rather, it was considered a necessity to preserve divine bloodlines. Pharaohs were seen as gods on earth, and as such, the purity of their lineage had to be maintained. This was done by marrying within the family, particularly between brothers and sisters, to mimic the relationship between the gods Isis and Osiris, who were siblings as well as spouses. For Egyptians, their gods provided a model for life on earth, and the pharaohs, viewed as divine figures, followed this divine example. This practice was common throughout many dynasties. Marriages between siblings were particularly notable during the Ptolemaic dynasty, with famous figures like Cleopatra marrying her brother Ptolemy XIII. The marriage of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, as well as other royal unions, helped maintain what was considered the godlike status of the pharaohs. However, incestuous marriages weren't limited to royalty out of tradition alone. It was a way to concentrate political power. By keeping marriages within the family, the royal family could retain control over the throne and limit potential power struggles or outside influences. The belief that pharaohs were descended from the gods further justified these marriages, since only those of divine blood could rule, and marrying a sibling ensured that the royal blood remained pure. Number 12. Osiris and the Golden Phallus. The story of Osiris and the Golden Phallus shows how in ancient Egypt, eroticism and divinity were so connected. When the god Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set, his body was chopped up and scattered across Egypt. However, Isis, Osiris' loyal and determined wife, gathered up the pieces but couldn't find one crucial part, his phallus. In the ultimate act of devotion and divine engineering, she created a golden phallus to complete his body. With this magical golden member, Isis conceived their son, Horus, establishing that even in death, Osiris could still create life. For this purpose, the golden phallus was used. That's where this story does not become of sex, but of resurrection, power, and the unstoppable force of creation. Number 11. Menstrual blood as a potion. Ingredient. In ancient Egypt, the idea of using menstrual blood might make people cringe today, but back then, it was powerful magic. For the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't just blood, it was seen as raw, life-giving energy. That's because Egyptian society didn't shy away from the power of the body, especially when it came to women and their connection to fertility and creation. Therefore, menstrual blood wasn't considered taboo. It was infused with divine power. Tied to goddesses like Isis and Hathor, it was believed to hold the essence of life itself, and using it in rituals was a way to channel that power directly from the divine feminine. Egyptians believed that menstrual blood carried the force of life, connected to the cycle of life and death. It was more than just physical. This was spiritual energy that could bring fertility, not just for women, but also for the land. It might be added to potions that were used to ensure crops flourished, or to bless animals and ensure they multiplied. Not only that, but if ancient Egyptians wanted to invoke the favor of gods like Isis, menstrual blood wasn't just symbolic, it was the real deal. The blood might have been included in potions or charms meant to restore vitality, protect women's reproductive health, or even influence childbirth. Furthermore, bodily fluids were tied to magic in all its forms, so menstrual blood could even be used in protective amulets, believed to keep evil spirits and misfortune away. The Egyptians understood life and death as part of a cycle, and the potent energy of menstrual blood tapped into the deepest mysteries of that cycle. Number 10. Finger amputation as mourning. Egyptians were serious about mourning. We are not talking about shedding a few tears. For some, particularly those closest to the pharaoh, the grief went straight to the bone, literally. To show grief, loyalty, devotion, and pain, a finger could be cut off. This mostly happened when someone of high rank, especially a pharaoh, died. The mourning process would turn brutal. Cutting off a finger was not just about physical pain, it was a way of saying, "I am forever bound to you." It was as if by removing a part of their body, the mourner was offering part of their soul to the deceased, ensuring that their bond would last beyond the grave. And whenever that person saw their mutilated finger, they would recall they had lost their loved one. In this way, the grief existed forever for the one who mutilated their finger. Number 9. Erotic art and satirical depictions. It's little known, but ancient Egypt had its version of graphic novels, and they were not shy about getting erotic. The Turin erotic papyrus is a prime example, packed with explicit depictions of men and women engaged in sexual acts, but with a twist. These weren't just sensual images, they were often ridiculous, exaggerated to the point of humor. Men were depicted with impossibly large genitalia, or engaging in absurd sexual positions, sometimes alongside animals or in comical scenarios, showing that the Egyptians had no problem poking fun at sex. It was both erotic and satirical. They had an openness about sex that would make modern societies blush, and they weren't afraid to laugh at it. More importantly, this art was not hidden away. It was a part of their culture, showing that for them, sex was both sacred and something to joke about. Number 8. Use of sexual magic and amulets. In ancient Egypt, sex wasn't just about pleasure or reproduction, it was seen as a raw power. Therefore, sexual energy could be harnessed through magic, and it was believed that certain talismans could boost fertility, enhance sexual prowess, and protect against sexual misfortune. Even the phallus amulets were used, which were symbols of fertility, often associated with the god Min, who moved around with an erect phallus that screamed masculinity. People wore these amulets to bring sexual vitality into their lives, and they weren't just about personal bedroom antics. These symbols linked sexuality directly to the fertility of the land. If ancient Egyptians wanted to guarantee a bountiful harvest, they would better have some good sexual energy flowing through the community. Therefore, sexual magic was serious business, blending the personal with the cosmic to ensure life and crops thrived. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Number 7. Pregnant women peeing on barley plants. One of the most unusual methods for determining pregnancy in ancient Egypt involved a test that seems quite bizarre by today's standards. Women were asked to urinate on barley or emmer wheat. This practice was essentially an early form of a pregnancy test. The Egyptians believed that the growth of the plants, when exposed to a woman's urine, could indicate pregnancy and even predict the sex of the child. The idea was that if the barley grew, the woman was pregnant with a boy, and if the wheat grew, she was pregnant with a girl. If neither plant sprouted, the woman was not pregnant. Surprisingly, modern studies have shown that there is some scientific basis for this ancient practice. High levels of certain hormones in pregnant women's urine, such as estrogen, can promote plant growth. However, the accuracy of predicting the sex of the child remains unsubstantiated by any scientific evidence. Number 6. Public affection and open sexuality. While ancient Egypt had its share of complex rituals and strict social structures, one thing it wasn't uptight about was public displays of affection and sexuality. Unlike some later societies where sex and physical intimacy were taboo, the ancient Egyptians had a more relaxed approach. Couples were often depicted in art in affectionate poses, such as holding hands or embracing. These depictions weren't just limited to royalty. Everyday couples were shown sharing intimate moments, indicating that love and affection were a natural part of life. It's clear that sex was not seen as something to be hidden or shamed in ancient Egypt. Instead, it was part of everyday life, something to be joked about or enjoyed. Sexuality was embraced as a normal human function, and humor surrounding it shows a culture that wasn't shy about acknowledging this aspect of human life. Number 5. Crocodile dung as contraceptive. One of the more shocking practices of ancient Egyptian birth control involved the use of crocodile dung as a contraceptive. Women would mix the dung with honey and other ingredients, forming a paste that was inserted into her private part as a physical hurdle to prevent pregnancy. The belief was that this mixture would act as a barrier to conception, and some thought that the acidity of the dung might have spermicidal properties. While this method likely did not have the intended contraceptive effects, it does reflect how intertwined sexuality, fertility, and health were in Egyptian society. Ancient Egyptian women used a range of natural substances to control fertility, though many of these methods were based more on belief than actual efficacy. The use of animal dung, however, posed significant risks, including infections, which would make the practice unhygienic and even dangerous by today's standards. Number 4. Pharaohs Dwarfs. In most ancient societies, dwarfs were mere court jesters. However, in ancient Egypt, these individuals held positions of real influence and power, not just in society, but also in the royal courts. Pharaohs didn't just view dwarfs as oddities, they saw them as endowed with divine or magical properties. Their small stature wasn't something to pity, it was a sign of divine favor. Dwarfs were often believed to be under the protection of Bes, the dwarf-like god of protection, fertility, and home life. Therefore, the pharaohs didn't relegate dwarfs to the background. In fact, they played vital roles, not only as attendants to the pharaoh but also as artisans, particularly in crafts like jewelry making, which demanded precision and skill. Their unique physical presence became part of their mystique and power. Take Seneb, for example. He wasn't just a court dwarf. He held high-ranking administrative positions, managed estates, and was depicted alongside his wife in a grand tomb. Seneb's life shows how dwarves were far from marginalized. They had wealth, influence, and respect in Egyptian society. The pharaohs treated their dwarfs as personal attendants, but they also allowed them to rise to ranks that most people could only dream of. Whether managing royal estates or playing significant roles in religious ceremonies, dwarfs were a part of the fabric of Egypt's social and political world. Their presence was seen as both a sign of good fortune and a link to the divine. Number 3. Mummification and removal of organs. For ancient Egyptians, mummification was not just a creepy practice to preserve a body, it was the key to eternal life. Egyptians believed that if the body wasn't preserved, the soul couldn't survive in the afterlife. And so, they perfected the art of mummification, turning it into a detailed, often eerie process. First, the embalmer got down to business with some serious internal organ extraction. They were masters in this. The stomach, liver, intestines, and lungs were taken out through an incision on the left side of the body. They were then cleaned, dried, and placed in canopic jars, each jar guarded by a protective deity, one of the 4 sons of Horus. They believed these organs would be needed again in the afterlife, so they weren't discarded, but carefully stored alongside the body. Interestingly, the brain was also extracted in precise surgery, which still blows people's minds today. Using a hooked instrument, embalmers liquefied and pulled the brain out through the nostrils. The heart, which they considered the center of intelligence, emotions, and memories, was left intact inside the body because it was crucial for the weighing of the heart ceremony in the afterlife. This was a divine judgment, where the heart was weighed against the feather of Mayat, symbolizing truth. If the heart was light, the person would get to enjoy the afterlife. Number 2. Necropolis workers and grave robbing. While the royal tombs and burial practices of ancient Egypt were supposed to be sacred, the very people who helped build these monumental graves, the necropolis workers, were often the first to plunder them. They knew the tombs inside out. They had the blueprints, the access, and most importantly, the knowledge of exactly where the treasures were buried. Gold, jewelry, precious artifacts, the stuff meant to carry pharaohs into the afterlife, were just too tempting for these workers to leave untouched. However, the tombs were supposedly protected by spiritual forces, and robbing them wasn't just theft. It was a crime against the gods. But despite the risk of eternal damnation or divine retribution, the sheer wealth inside those tombs was worth every ounce of danger for these looters. Therefore, mummified bodies, wrapped in costly linens and preserved with rare oils, were sometimes stolen along with the treasures. Number 1. The ritual of opening the mouth. If you think mummification is creepy, wait until you hear about the opening of the mouth ritual. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't just the end, it was the beginning of an entire afterlife journey. But for the dead to thrive in the next world, they had to eat, drink, speak, and breathe just like they did in life. This was done through bizarre ceremonies, where a priest would reactivate the dead by literally opening their senses. The priest used a special tool, which looked like an adze, to touch the mummy's mouth. This wasn't some casual gesture. The priest recited powerful spells while performing the ritual, symbolically unlocking the mouth and restoring the deceased's ability to function in the afterlife. No magic words meant no eating or drinking, and no chance of survival in the next world. Now, this might sound like some magical fantasy, but to the Egyptians, it was real and necessary. The afterlife was considered a continuation of life on Earth, and without the ritual, the dead would be left powerless, unable to receive offerings from their family or defend themselves against the dangers of the underworld. Did you know that such practices were normal in ancient Egypt? Isn't it true that we have paid too much attention to the pyramids, ignoring the questionable side of ancient Egypt? In the comments section right below, share your thoughts on the bizarre things done in ancient Egypt, and what if they continue to this day? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.